I never thought I would become the kind of person who fights with a homeowners association. But there I was on a frozen February morning in Rochester, Minnesota, staring at Susan Pemberton through my storm door while she waved a printed copy of the HOA bylaws in my face like it was the Constitution itself. "Warren Nichols, this is completely unacceptable," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut through the Arctic wind that was howling across my front yard. "Your snow pile is clearly in violation of Section 7, subsection C of our community guidelines. It needs to be removed immediately." I looked past her at the pile of snow in question. It sat at the edge of my driveway, maybe 4 feet high, packed solid from 3 consecutive snowstorms that had dumped nearly 2 feet of white powder on our neighborhood in the last week. Every house on Maple Ridge Drive had similar piles. Mine was nothing special. "Susan, everyone has snow piles right now," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "Where exactly am I supposed to put it? Should I mail it to Florida?" Her lips pressed into a thin line, and I could see the red creeping up her neck despite the cold. Susan was the president of the Maple Ridge Homeowners Association, a position she took more seriously than most people take their actual jobs. She was 52, wore her blonde hair in a bob that never moved even in high wind, and had the kind of personality that made you double-check that you had locked your car doors. The bylaws clearly state that snow piles cannot exceed 3 feet in height and must be placed at least 6 feet from the roadway. Yours is both too tall and too close to the street. I measured it myself this morning. I stepped out onto my porch, immediately regretting it as the cold hit me through my sweatshirt. "You came over here with a measuring tape. I take my responsibilities seriously," she said, lifting her chin. "Unlike some people in this neighborhood. Susan, it's snow. It will melt in a few weeks when spring comes. This is Minnesota. We all have snow piles. Not in violation of our community standards, we don't," she said. She pulled out her phone and started taking pictures of my snow pile from multiple angles like she was documenting a crime scene. "I'm giving you 24 hours to remedy this situation. If you fail to comply, I'll have no choice but to involve law enforcement." I actually laughed at that. "You're going to call the cops on my snow pile?" "The HOA has the authority to enforce our bylaws through any means necessary," she said primly. "This is your only warning, Warren." She turned on her heel and marched back down my driveway, her boots crunching in the snow. I watched her climb into her white Lexus SUV and drive away, probably heading to harass some other neighbor about their mailbox placement or unauthorized wreath. I went back inside and poured myself another cup of coffee, figuring that would be the end of it. Susan was always making threats she never followed through on. Last summer, she had threatened to fine my neighbor Dave for having his trash cans visible from the street. Nothing ever came of it, but I should have known better. Susan Pemberton was not the kind of woman who made idle threats. The next morning, I was in my garage working on my workbench when I heard the crunch of tires on snow. I looked out to see a Rochester Police Department cruiser pulling up in front of my house. My stomach dropped. She had actually done it. She had actually called the police about a snow pile. I walked out to meet the officer as he was getting out of his car. He was a younger guy, maybe early 30s, with a friendly face that looked like he was already trying not to laugh about whatever call had brought him here. "Good morning, sir. I'm Officer Mike Daniels with the Rochester PD." "Are you Warren Nichols?" "That's me," I said. "Let me guess. Someone called you about my snow." He smiled and pulled out a small notebook. "Yeah, I have to admit, this is a new one for me. I've been on the force for 6 years and I've never gotten a call about snow pile placement before. But we have to respond to all complaints, so here I am." "This is insane," I said. "It's just snow. Everyone on this street has the exact same setup. I hear you, Officer Daniels said. But the caller, a Susan Pemberton, claims you're in violation of your HOA bylaws, and she's requesting that we document the violation. Do you mind if I take a look? Be my guest, I said, gesturing toward the driveway. We walked over to the snow pile together. Officer Daniels pulled out a measuring tape from his belt and extended it along the side of the pile. He measured the height, then the distance from the street. I stood there with my arms crossed, feeling ridiculous that a police officer was measuring my snow. Okay, he said after a moment, making notes in his book. The height is measuring at 3 feet 6 inches, and the distance from the road is 6 feet 6 inches. I blinked. Wait, what? Susan said I was over. Officer Daniels showed me his measuring tape. See for yourself. 3 foot 6, and the distance to the street curb is 6 feet 6 inches. What does the HOA bylaw actually say? I asked. He pulled out a printed copy of the complaint that Susan must have given the dispatcher. Says here that snow piles cannot exceed 3 feet in height and must be at least 6 feet from the roadway. So I'm within code. By 6 inches on both counts, Officer Daniels confirmed. The pile is 6 inches taller than allowed, but the placement is 6 inches farther than required, so you're actually in compliance on the distance. He paused. Though technically the height does exceed the 3-foot limit, my heart sank. So what happens now? Officer Daniels looked at the pile, then back at his notes, then at me. Well, here's the thing. I'm not an HOA enforcement officer. I'm a police officer, and as far as I can tell, you're not breaking any city ordinances. Your snow is on your property. It's not blocking the sidewalk or the street, and it's not creating any kind of safety hazard. The HOA bylaws are a civil matter between you and your homeowners association. So you're not going to make me move it. I don't have the authority to make you do anything about a snow pile that's not violating city code, he said. What I will do is document my measurements and file a report. If your HOA wants to pursue this further, that's between you and them. But from a police standpoint, there's no violation here that I can see. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Thank you, officer. I really appreciate you being reasonable about this. No problem, he said. Though if I were you, I might want to attend your next HOA meeting and discuss these bylaws. 3 feet for a snow pile in Minnesota is pretty unrealistic. One good storm and everyone's going to be over that limit. He was right about that. The bylaws had probably been written by someone who had never actually dealt with a Minnesota winter, or more likely, Susan had pushed them through during a summer meeting when nobody was thinking about snow. Officer Daniels went back to his cruiser and drove off. I stood in my driveway, looking at my perfectly legal snow pile, and wondered if this would finally be the end of it. It was not the end of it. That afternoon, my phone rang. It was my neighbor from across the street, Tom Hendricks. Warren, did the cops just leave your house? Yeah, Susan called them about my snow pile. You're kidding me. She called the police. Apparently, she has nothing better to do with her time, I said. But the officer measured everything and said I'm within code. Well, technically the height is 6 inches over, but the placement is 6 inches farther than required, so it balances out. Tom was quiet for a moment. Warren, you need to be careful. Susan is losing it. She came by my house last week and threatened to fine me because my house numbers aren't the right font. The right font, Warren. Who cares what font house numbers are in? She's always been intense, but this is getting ridiculous, I said. It's getting worse, Tom said. I heard from Barbara next door that Susan has been walking around the neighborhood every morning with a clipboard, documenting every possible violation she can find. She's on some kind of power trip. After I hung up with Tom, I decided to do some research. I pulled out the HOA bylaws that we had all received when we bought our houses. I had skimmed them when I first moved in 3 years ago, but I had never really read them in detail. The snow pile regulation was indeed in there, just as Susan had said. 3 feet maximum height, minimum 6 feet from the roadway. But as I kept reading, I found something interesting. The bylaws also stated that the HOA board had to provide written notice of any violation and give the homeowner a reasonable amount of time to correct it before any fines could be assessed. Susan had given me verbal notice, but nothing in writing. More importantly, I found a section that outlined the limits of the HOA's enforcement powers. They could assess fines, but those fines couldn't exceed $200 per violation, and there was a process for appealing any decision made by the board. I was still reading when my wife Jennifer got home from work. She was a nurse at Mayo Clinic and had just finished a 12-hour shift. She looked exhausted as she dropped her bag by the door. "Hey, how was your day?" she asked, kicking off her shoes. "Susan called the cops on our snow pile," I said. Jennifer stopped in the middle of taking off her coat. "I'm sorry, what?" I filled her in on the whole situation. She listened with increasing disbelief, shaking her head. "That woman needs a hobby," Jennifer said, "or maybe a therapist." Officer Daniels measured everything and said we're technically in compliance, more or less. The height is a bit over, but the distance makes up for it. So it's done. "I hope so," I said. "But Tom warned me that Susan's been on some kind of violation documentation spree lately." Jennifer sighed and headed for the kitchen. "Well, hopefully she'll find someone else to bother and leave us alone." But Susan Pemberton was not the type to leave anyone alone, especially not when she thought she was right. 2 days later, I found an envelope taped to my front door. Inside was an official-looking letter on Maple Ridge HOA letterhead. It informed me that I was in violation of Section 7, subsection C of the community bylaws, and that I had been assessed a fine of $200. The letter stated that if I did not remove the snow pile and pay the fine within 14 days, the HOA would pursue further legal action. I called Jennifer at work. "She's fining us $200 for the snow pile." "Yep." Even though the police officer said it was fine. "Apparently that doesn't matter to Susan," I said. I could hear the frustration in my own voice. "She's citing the bylaws." "So what are we going to do?" "I'm going to appeal it," I said. "The bylaws have a process for that. I need to submit a written appeal to the HOA board within 7 days. That evening, I drafted my appeal letter. I outlined the facts: that Officer Daniels had measured the snow pile and found it to be within acceptable limits when considering both height and distance, that Susan had not followed the proper notification procedure, and that the fine was unreasonable given the circumstances. I printed 3 copies and hand-delivered them to each member of the HOA board that night. The board consisted of 3 people: Susan as president, a retired accountant named Harold Foster as treasurer, and a woman named Patricia Lynn as secretary. I knew Harold slightly. We had chatted at a few neighborhood barbecues. Patricia I had only met once or twice. Harold answered his door in a cardigan sweater, reading glasses perched on his nose. "Warren, good evening. What can I do for you?" "I'm delivering an appeal regarding the fine Susan assessed against me," I said, handing him the letter. He took it and scanned the first few lines, his eyebrows rising. "She fined you over that snow pile. You knew about it. She mentioned it at our last board meeting," Harold said carefully. "But I thought she was just going to send you a reminder notice, not jump straight to a fine." "Did she mention that she called the police?" Harold's eyebrows went even higher. "She did what?" I told him the whole story. He listened, his expression growing more concerned with each detail. "Warren, I'll be honest with you," he said when I finished. "Susan has been getting more aggressive with enforcement lately. Between you and me, Patricia and I have been getting worried about it. She sent violation notices to 12 different homes last month alone. 12. Most of them were minor things. A garbage can left out too long. Christmas lights still up in January, that kind of thing. But people are starting to complain. We've gotten some pretty angry emails. So what happens with my appeal? The board will review it and vote. We have to hold a meeting within 30 days of receiving the appeal. I'll make sure we schedule something soon." I delivered the same letter to Patricia, who had a similar reaction. She seemed embarrassed by the whole situation and promised to review my appeal carefully. The next week passed quietly. The snow pile sat in my driveway, slowly compacting under its own weight. The temperature stayed below freezing, so there was no melting yet. I went to work each day at the engineering firm where I was a project manager, and came home to find my house still standing, and no new threatening letters from Susan. Then, on a Wednesday evening, I got a phone call from Harold. "Warren, we've scheduled the appeal hearing for this Friday at 7 p.m. at the community center. Can you make it?" "I'll be there," I said. "Good. And Warren, I think you should know that Susan is planning to bring documentation, photos, measurements, the police report. She's treating this like a court case." "Of course she is," I said. That Friday, Jennifer came with me to the community center for moral support. The meeting room was small, with a folding table at the front where the 3 board members sat. Susan was in the middle, with Harold and Patricia on either side. There were a few other residents in the chairs facing the table, probably there to watch the show. Susan called the meeting to order with a sharp rap of her gavel. Yes, she actually had a gavel. "We're here to address the appeal submitted by Warren Nichols regarding a fine assessed for a snow pile violation," she said, her voice formal and cold. "Mr. Nichols, you have 10 minutes to present your case." I stood up and walked to the front. I had prepared notes, but I decided to speak from the heart instead. "I'm not here to argue that I don't have a snow pile," I said. "I do. It's sitting in my driveway right now, just like the snow piles in front of half the houses in this neighborhood. What I'm here to argue is that the fine assessed against me is unreasonable and was not properly administered according to our own bylaws." I went through my points methodically. The police measurement that showed I was within acceptable limits. The lack of proper written notice before the fine was assessed. The fact that the bylaw itself was unrealistic for Minnesota winters. Susan listened with her arms crossed, her face impassive. Harold and Patricia took notes. When I finished, Susan immediately stood up. "If I may respond," she said, not waiting for permission. "Mr. Nichols is correct that Officer Daniels measured the snow pile. However, the officer's report clearly states that the pile height measured 3 feet 6 inches, which is 6 inches over our 3-foot limit. That is a violation, plain and simple. But the distance from the road was 6 inches farther than required," I countered. "Doesn't that balance it out?" "The bylaws don't have a balancing provision," Susan said sharply. "Each requirement is separate. The height limit is 3 feet. Your pile exceeds that. Therefore, you are in violation." Harold cleared his throat. "Susan, I have a question. When were these snow pile regulations last reviewed by the board?" Susan's jaw tightened. "They were established when the HOA was founded in 2008. "So 18 years ago," Harold said. "And have they ever been updated or revised?" "The bylaws don't need to be updated just because people find them inconvenient," Susan said. "I'm not suggesting that," Harold said calmly. "But I am pointing out that a 3-foot limit for snow piles in Minnesota is difficult to maintain during heavy snow years. This has been an unusually snowy winter. We've had over 2 feet of accumulation in the last 3 weeks alone. Patricia spoke up for the first time. I also want to note that I've driven through the neighborhood several times this week, and at least 15 homes have snow piles that appear to exceed 3 feet. Are we planning to fine all of them? If they're in violation, then yes, Susan said, but there was less certainty in her voice now. That would be $3,000 in fines, Patricia said. For snow that will melt in a few weeks anyway. Does that really seem reasonable? The room was silent for a moment. I could see Susan's face reddening. The rules exist for a reason, she said finally. If we don't enforce them, what's the point of having an HOA at all? The point is to maintain property values and ensure the neighborhood looks nice, Harold said. But we also need to be reasonable. Warren's snow pile isn't an eyesore. It's not blocking anything. It's just snow. Susan looked like she wanted to argue more, but she must have realized she was losing the room. Fine. Let's vote on the appeal. All in favor of overturning the fine against Warren Nichols. Harold and Patricia both raised their hands immediately. Opposed. Susan raised her own hand, but she was outvoted 2-1. The appeal is sustained, Harold said. The fine is overturned, Warren. You don't owe anything, and we'll be reviewing our snow pile regulations before next winter. I felt relief wash over me. Thank you. Susan gathered her papers with sharp, angry movements. This meeting is adjourned, she snapped, and she stood up and walked out of the room without another word. Jennifer squeezed my hand. That went well. For now, I said. After the meeting, Harold came over to talk to us. Warren, I want to apologize for all this. Susan has been under a lot of stress lately, but that's no excuse for how she's been acting. Patricia and I are going to have a serious conversation with her about enforcement procedures. I appreciate that, I said. I'm not trying to make trouble. I just think the rules need to be reasonable. You're absolutely right, Harold said. We'll get this sorted out. Jennifer and I drove home in comfortable silence. I thought the whole mess was finally behind us. I should have known better. The following Tuesday, I got home from work to find my snow pile had been vandalized. Someone had spray painted a large red X on it, and there was a sign stuck in the top that read, "Bylaw Violator." I stood there staring at it, feeling my blood pressure rise. This was beyond petty. This was harassment. I pulled out my phone and took pictures from every angle. Then I pulled the sign out and brought it inside. The sign was printed on the same cardstock that Susan used for all her HOA notices. Jennifer was furious when she saw it. She came onto our property and vandalized our snow pile. That's trespassing. I can't prove it was her, I said, but we both knew it was. Those pictures prove it, Jennifer said, pointing to my phone. That's her sign, her printer, probably her spray paint. I called Officer Daniels. He had given me his card during his initial visit, telling me to call if there were any further issues. He showed up 20 minutes later and looked at the vandalized snow pile with a tired expression. Let me guess, he said. Susan Pemberton. I can't prove it, but who else would it be? He took his own photos and made notes in his report book. The problem is that you're right. You can't prove it was her, unless you have security cameras that caught her in the act. No cameras, I said. I never thought I'd need them. I'll go talk to her, Officer Daniels said. Make sure she knows this isn't acceptable. Even if I can't charge her with anything, sometimes a police visit is enough to make people think twice. After he left, I spent the rest of the evening trying to clean the spray paint off the snow pile, which was ridiculous when I stopped to think about it. I was scrubbing snow, but it was the principle of the thing. Susan had come onto my property and defaced it, and I wasn't going to let that stand. The next morning, I was getting ready for work when I heard shouting outside. I looked out the window to see Susan standing in her driveway across the street, yelling at Officer Daniels. I couldn't hear what she was saying, but her gestures were wild and angry. Officer Daniels stood calmly with his arms crossed, occasionally saying something in response. The confrontation lasted about 10 minutes before Susan threw her hands up and stormed back into her house, slamming the door hard enough that I could hear it from inside my own home. Officer Daniels walked across the street and rang my doorbell. "That went well," I said when I opened the door. He smiled ruefully. "She denied everything, of course. Said she would never trespass on your property and that you're trying to frame her because you're upset about the fine." "The fine that got overturned," I pointed out. I mentioned that. She didn't have much to say to it. He paused. "Look, Mr. Nichols, I'm going to be straight with you. Unless you get cameras and catch her doing something, or unless she escalates to something more serious, there's not much I can do. This is fundamentally a civil dispute between neighbors." "I understand," I said. "Thanks for trying." "But," he continued, "I did inform her that if there are any more incidents of vandalism or harassment, we'll be taking it very seriously. And I mentioned that you have every right to install security cameras on your property if you choose to." After Officer Daniels left, I called Jennifer. "I'm installing cameras today." "Good idea," she said. "I'll feel better knowing we have them anyway." I took a long lunch that day and went to the hardware store. I bought a basic 4-camera security system with night vision and motion detection. It took me most of the evening to install, but by bedtime, I had cameras covering the front door, driveway, backyard, and the side of the house facing Susan's property. For a few days, nothing happened. The snow pile sat in my driveway, now marked with a fading red X. The cameras recorded the usual activity: me leaving for work, Jennifer coming home, the mail carrier delivering packages. Normal suburban life. Then, on Saturday morning at 2:30 a.m., my phone buzzed with a motion alert from the camera app. I grabbed it from my nightstand and opened the video feed. There was Susan Pemberton, dressed in dark clothing, creeping across my front yard with a shovel in her hands. I watched in real time as she approached my snow pile and started shoveling snow from it onto my front walkway, deliberately piling it in front of my door. "Jennifer, wake up," I said, shaking my wife's shoulder. "You have to see this." We both watched on my phone as Susan spent the next 15 minutes moving snow from the pile onto my walkway and porch steps. When she was satisfied with her work, she stuck another sign in the remaining pile and hurried back to her own house. "Is she insane?" Jennifer whispered. "Why would she do that?" "Because she's obsessed," I said. I was already pulling on clothes. "I'm calling the police." "Wait until she's actually gone," Jennifer said. "Make sure you have the whole thing on video." We watched until Susan was safely back in her own house. Then I called the non-emergency police line and explained what had happened. The dispatcher said she would send an officer right away. Officer Daniels arrived 30 minutes later. I met him outside and showed him the video on my phone. His expression darkened as he watched. "Well, that's trespassing and vandalism," he said. "That's enough for charges. Can you send me that video?" "Already done," I said. I had emailed it to him from my phone while waiting for him to arrive. He walked around to look at the snow pile and the walkway. Susan had moved a significant amount of snow, and the sign she had planted read, "Final warning, remove this pile or face consequences." "That almost sounds like a threat," Officer Daniels said, taking photos of the sign. "It is a threat," I said. "What kind of consequences is she talking about?" "That's what I'm going to find out," he said. He walked across the street and knocked on Susan's door. It took a while for her to answer. When she finally opened the door, she was in a bathrobe, her hair messy, playing at having just woken up. "Officer Daniels, what's going on? Do you know what time it is, Miss Pemberton? I need to speak with you about an incident that occurred at Warren Nichols' property approximately 45 minutes ago." "I have no idea what you're talking about," she said. "I've been asleep." "Miss Pemberton, Mr. Nichols has security cameras. We have clear video of you trespassing on his property and vandalizing his snow pile at 2:30 this morning." Her face went pale, then red. "That's not possible. I've seen the video myself. Your face is clearly visible. I'm going to need you to come down to the station to answer some questions." "I'm not going anywhere," Susan said, starting to close the door. "I know my rights." Officer Daniels put his hand on the door. "Madam, you can either come voluntarily or I can arrest you right now for criminal trespassing and vandalism. Your choice." Susan stared at him for a long moment, and I could see the calculation happening behind her eyes. She was trying to figure out if he was bluffing. "I want to call my lawyer," she said finally. "You can call your lawyer from the station," Officer Daniels said. "Are you coming voluntarily?" She looked past him at me, standing in my driveway. The hatred in her eyes was startling. "Fine," she spat. "Let me get dressed." Officer Daniels waited while she changed, then walked her to his cruiser. He didn't handcuff her, which I thought was generous given the circumstances. Several neighbors had come out to watch, drawn by the police car's lights. I saw Tom from across the street and Patricia from the HOA board, and several others whose names I didn't know. Susan kept her head high as she got into the back of the cruiser, refusing to look at anyone. After they drove away, Patricia hurried across the street. "Warren, what happened?" I showed her the video. She watched with her mouth open, shaking her head in disbelief. "I knew she was taking things too far, but I never thought she would do something like this," Patricia said. "This is criminal. She could be arrested." "I think she just was," I said. "Harold needs to see this," Patricia said. "We're going to have to call an emergency board meeting. Susan can't be HOA president anymore. This is completely unacceptable." The sun was starting to come up by the time I finished giving my statement to another officer who arrived to document the scene. Jennifer made coffee, and we sat at the kitchen table watching the neighborhood wake up. People left for work. Morning joggers went by. Life continued as normal. But I knew nothing was going to be normal in Maple Ridge for a while. Susan was released later that morning. Officer Daniels called to tell me that she had been charged with criminal trespassing and vandalism, both misdemeanors. She would have to appear in court, and there would likely be a fine and possibly probation. "She's claiming it was justified because you were in violation of the HOA bylaws," Officer Daniels said. Her lawyer tried to argue that she was acting within her authority as HOA president. "That's ridiculous. The board overturned the fine. I know, the charges are standing, but I wanted you to be aware that she's not backing down. If anything, she seems more convinced that she's right." That was concerning. I had hoped that getting arrested would shock Susan into realizing how far she had taken things. But apparently not. The emergency HOA board meeting was held that Sunday evening. This time, the community center was packed. Nearly every homeowner in Maple Ridge showed up, all of them curious about what had happened with Susan. Harold called the meeting to order. Susan was not present. According to Harold, she had been suspended from the board pending the outcome of the criminal charges. "We're here to discuss the recent incidents involving our HOA president and the enforcement of our bylaws," Harold said. "I think it's clear to everyone that things have gotten out of hand. The board has failed in its responsibility to govern reasonably and fairly, and for that, Patricia and I apologize." There were murmurs of agreement from the crowd. Harold continued, We're proposing several changes. First, Susan Pemberton will be removed as HOA president, effective immediately. Second, we'll be conducting a complete review of all our bylaws, with input from the entire community. Third, we're implementing new oversight procedures to prevent any single board member from abusing their authority. What about all the fines Susan has been handing out? Someone called from the back. It was my neighbor Tom. We'll be reviewing every fine assessed in the last year, Patricia said. Any that are deemed unreasonable will be overturned and refunded. The meeting lasted 2 hours. Person after person stood up to share their own stories of Susan's overreach. She had fined a single mother for having a bicycle in her front yard. She had threatened to put a lien on an elderly man's house because his mailbox was slightly crooked. She had sent violation notices to a family for having their garage door open during the day while they were working on a project. The stories painted a picture of someone who had let a small amount of power go entirely to her head. I felt validated, but I also felt sad. This was our neighborhood. We were supposed to be a community, not enemies. By the end of the meeting, the vote was unanimous. Susan was removed from the board, Harold would serve as interim president, and a special election would be held in a month to fill the position properly. As everyone was leaving, a younger woman I didn't recognize approached me. She looked nervous. "Mr. Nichols, I'm Amanda Foster, Harold's daughter. I'm an attorney." "Nice to meet you," I said, shaking her hand. "I wanted to give you a heads up," she said quietly. "My dad mentioned what's been going on, and I did some research. There's a possibility that Susan might try to sue you civilly for defamation or harassment." "But I didn't do anything to her," I protested. "She's the one who trespassed on my property." "I know, and you'd win easily if she did sue. But I wanted you to be prepared just in case. People who are facing criminal charges sometimes lash out in other ways." "Great," I said. "That's just what I need." "If she does serve you with any legal papers, give me a call," Amanda said, handing me her business card. "I do some pro bono work and I'd be happy to help. What Susan did was wrong, and the whole neighborhood knows it." I thanked her and headed home with Jennifer. The snow pile was still in my driveway, now somewhat smaller thanks to Susan's middle-of-the-night excavation project. The red X had faded even more. In a weird way, it had become a symbol of the whole absurd situation. "Should we just get rid of it?" Jennifer asked as we pulled into the garage. "The pile, I mean, just to be done with all of this." "No way," I said. "That pile is staying until it melts naturally." "I'm not letting Susan win." Jennifer laughed. "You're stubborn, you know that. I prefer principled," I said. Over the next few weeks, life slowly returned to normal. The snow began to melt as March arrived and temperatures crept above freezing. My pile shrank day by day, the red X fading into nothing. Susan's court date arrived on a chilly Wednesday in mid-March. I had been subpoenaed to testify, so I took the day off work and drove to the courthouse in downtown Rochester. Officer Daniels was there too, along with the video evidence from my security cameras. Susan arrived with her lawyer, a slick-looking man in an expensive suit. She was dressed conservatively, her hair perfect, her expression neutral. She didn't look at me as we waited for the case to be called. The hearing was relatively brief. The prosecutor presented the video evidence, which was damning. There was no way to deny what it showed. Susan's lawyer tried to argue that she had been acting in her official capacity as HOA president, but the judge shut that down immediately. "Miss Pemberton, your role as president of a homeowners association does not give you the right to trespass on private property or vandalize someone's belongings," the judge said sternly. "These are criminal acts, regardless of your motivations." In the end, Susan pleaded no contest to both charges. She was fined $1,000, ordered to pay restitution for my security camera system, and placed on 6 months of probation. The judge also issued a restraining order requiring her to stay at least 100 feet away from my property, unless there was an emergency. As we left the courthouse, Susan's lawyer stopped me in the hallway. "My client would like to apologize," he said. I looked at Susan. She stared at a point somewhere over my left shoulder, her jaw tight. "I'm sorry for the distress I caused," she said, the words clearly rehearsed. I let my responsibilities get the better of me. It wasn't a real apology, and we both knew it, but I nodded anyway. "I accept your apology," I said. "I hope we can both move on from this." She didn't respond, just turned and walked away with her lawyer. Officer Daniels came up beside me. That went as well as could be expected. "I just want this to be over," I said. "It is over," he said. "She's on probation, there's a restraining order, and she's been removed from the HOA board. She can't bother you anymore." He was mostly right. Susan kept to herself after that. I would occasionally see her leaving her house or getting her mail, but she never looked in my direction. The restraining order meant she couldn't come near my property, which was a relief. The special HOA election happened in April. A retired teacher named Robert Martinez was elected as the new president. He immediately set about reforming the bylaws, starting with the snow pile regulations. The new rule was simple. Snow piles were allowed to be up to 6 feet tall and could be placed anywhere on the property as long as they didn't block sidewalks or streets. Much more reasonable. Robert also implemented a new policy requiring all fines to be approved by a majority of the board, not just the president acting alone. And he established a community feedback system so residents could raise concerns before they escalated into conflicts. My snow pile had completely melted by late April. Spring arrived with its usual Minnesota muddy chaos, and the grass started to green up. I spent a Saturday repairing the damage to my lawn where Susan had spray painted the snow, and slowly, the physical evidence of the whole mess disappeared. But the story wasn't quite over. In early May, I got a phone call from Patricia from the HOA board. "Warren, I wanted to let you know that Susan Pemberton has put her house up for sale," she said. "Really?" "Yeah, it went on the market this morning." I guess she decided she couldn't stay in the neighborhood after everything that happened. I felt a mix of emotions about that. Part of me was relieved that the source of so much conflict would be gone, but part of me felt bad. Susan had let her need for control destroy her standing in the community. That couldn't have been what she wanted when she first became HOA president. "I hope she finds some peace wherever she goes," I said, and I meant it. "You're a better person than I am," Patricia said. "After everything she put you through, I'd be happy to see her go." Susan's house sold quickly, and she moved out in early June. I watched from my window as the moving truck loaded up her furniture and belongings. She took one last look at the neighborhood before getting into her Lexus and driving away. I never saw her again. The new owners who moved in were a young couple with a toddler. They introduced themselves as Kevin and Rachel Warner, and they were friendly and easygoing. Kevin mentioned that they had heard about some HOA drama, but were assured it had all been resolved. "We're not too worried," Kevin said with a laugh. "We're pretty low-key people. As long as we can keep our lawn mowed and our house painted, we'll be fine." "That's all anyone expects," I assured him. "Welcome to the neighborhood." That summer was peaceful. Jennifer and I hosted a block party in July, and nearly everyone on Maple Ridge Drive came. Tom and his wife brought burgers to grill. Patricia and her husband made their famous potato salad. Harold told stories about the old days before the HOA existed, when everyone just looked out for each other without needing rules and bylaws. Robert Martinez gave a short speech thanking everyone for their patience during the transition period. "We're a community first and an HOA second," he said. "Let's remember that." Everyone applauded, and I felt grateful to be living in a place where people actually cared about each other. In August, I got one final piece of closure. Amanda Foster, Harold's daughter, called me. "I thought you'd want to know that Susan Pemberton tried to sue the HOA for wrongful termination," she said. "Did she win? Not even close. The judge threw it out immediately. You can't be wrongfully terminated from a volunteer position, especially after being convicted of criminal charges related to that position." "So it's really over now." "It's really over," Amanda confirmed. "Susan can't do anything else. She has no legal standing, no position of authority, and the restraining order prevents her from even coming back to the neighborhood." I thanked her for letting me know and hung up feeling lighter than I had in months. That winter, when the first snow fell in November, I deliberately left my snow pile a little higher than necessary. Not enough to violate the new bylaws, but enough to remind myself that I had stood up for what was right. The pile sat in my driveway all winter long, slowly growing with each new snowfall, and nobody said a word about it. The following spring, Jennifer and I were sitting on our porch enjoying the warm weather when Tom walked over with a couple of beers. "I've been meaning to tell you something," he said, handing me a beer. "You standing up to Susan like that, it inspired a lot of us. She had been pushing people around for years, but nobody wanted to make waves. You showed us that it's okay to push back when something's wrong." "I didn't really have a choice," I said. "She came after me." "But you didn't just roll over and accept it," Tom said. "You fought back legally and properly. You documented everything, you followed the rules, and you won. That matters." Jennifer smiled. "He did get pretty obsessed with it there for a while." "It was the principle of the thing," I protested. "It was a snow pile," Jennifer said, laughing. "It was never about the snow pile," I said. "It was about someone abusing their power and making people miserable for no good reason." Tom raised his beer. "Well, here's to standing up for what's right, even when it's about something as stupid as snow pile placement." We clinked bottles and drank, and I looked out at my perfectly normal suburban street with its perfectly normal houses and perfectly normal yards. It was the kind of place where nothing interesting was supposed to happen, where HOA meetings were boring and neighbors were friendly and snow piles were just snow piles. But for a few months there, my snow pile had been the center of a neighborhood drama that ended with police involvement, criminal charges, and a complete restructuring of our HOA governance. It had been exhausting and frustrating and sometimes scary. But in the end, it had brought the community together in a way that never would have happened otherwise. Robert Martinez stopped by later that day to drop off the new HOA newsletter. It included a full financial report, a calendar of upcoming events, and a reminder that the annual meeting would be held in June. "Everything going well?" I asked. "Smooth as glass," Robert said. "Turns out when you treat people with respect and enforce rules reasonably, nobody has any problems with the HOA. Imagine that," I said with a smile. "Oh, and Warren," Robert said as he was leaving. "The board wanted me to thank you officially. What you went through with Susan was terrible, but it exposed some serious problems with how we were operating. We're a better organization now because of it." "I'm just glad it's over," I said. "It is over," Robert assured me. "The snow pile saga is officially closed." He was right. The story that had started with Susan Pemberton pounding on my door about a pile of snow had ended with meaningful change to our community. The bylaws were more reasonable, the board was more accountable, and the neighborhood was more united. That night, as Jennifer and I were getting ready for bed, She asked me if I had any regrets about how I handled things. I wish I had installed the cameras sooner, I said. Could have saved a lot of time and stress. But you're glad you fought back, I thought about it. Fighting Susan had cost me time, money, and peace of mind. It had dominated my thoughts for weeks, but it had also resulted in real positive change for everyone in Maple Ridge. Yeah, I said. I'm glad I fought back. Sometimes the right thing to do is the hard thing to do. Jennifer kissed me on the cheek. I'm proud of you, even if you were kind of obsessed there for a while. It was a very important snow pile, I said seriously. She laughed and turned off the light, and we went to sleep in our perfectly normal house in our perfectly normal neighborhood, where the HOA president was no longer a tyrant and snow piles could be whatever height they needed to be. Years later, the story became something of a legend in Maple Ridge. New residents would hear about the snow pile incident and the HOA president who got arrested for trespassing in the middle of the night. It became a cautionary tale about the dangers of letting power go to your head, and a reminder that communities work best when people treat each other with respect. Harold eventually wrote up a brief history of the Maple Ridge HOA for a time capsule project the neighborhood did. He included a section about the reforms that were implemented after what he diplomatically called the enforcement crisis of 2026. He showed me the draft before submitting it. You're not mentioned by name, he said. I kept it vague, but anyone who was here will know what it's about. That's fine, I said. I don't need to be remembered as the snow pile guy. You'll be remembered as the guy who stood up for what was right, Harold said. That's not a bad legacy. He had a point. But mostly, I was just glad to be living in a neighborhood where HOA meetings were boring again, where violation notices were rare and reasonable, and where snow piles were allowed to exist in peace until they melted away naturally in the spring. The security cameras I had installed during the crisis stayed up. Every now and then, I would get a motion alert and check the video, half expecting to see someone sneaking across my lawn with a shovel. But it was always just the mail carrier or a delivery driver or a neighbor's cat. The neighborhood continued to thrive under Robert's leadership. He served as HOA president for 3 years before stepping down and being replaced by Patricia, who continued the policies of reasonable enforcement and community engagement. The Maple Ridge HOA became known in the broader Rochester area as one of the better-run homeowners associations, a place where the rules existed to help people rather than to punish them. And every winter, when the first snow fell and residents started building their snow piles, somebody would inevitably make a joke about checking with the HOA board first. It always got a laugh. The snow pile incident had been stressful while it was happening, but in retrospect, it was kind of funny. A grown woman sneaking around in the middle of the night to vandalize snow. A police officer measuring a pile of snow to determine if it was within code by 6 inches. An entire neighborhood uprising over bylaws that nobody had really read carefully until they became a problem. It was absurd, but it was also very human. People care about their homes and their neighborhoods. Sometimes they care too much and lose perspective. And sometimes it takes a ridiculous conflict over something as temporary as a snow pile to remind everyone what really matters. What really mattered wasn't whether the snow pile was 3 feet or 3 feet 6 inches. It wasn't whether the HOA bylaws were being followed to the letter. What mattered was that neighbors treated each other with respect, that people in positions of authority used their power responsibly, and that communities worked together to solve problems rather than creating new ones. These days, when I'm out shoveling my driveway after a snowstorm, I sometimes think about that pile that caused so much trouble. I remember the red X spray painted on it, the sign declaring me a bylaw violator, the middle-of-the-night vandalism, the police cruiser in my driveway. And then I look around at my neighborhood, at the friendly faces and well-maintained homes and the overall sense of community, and I feel grateful that the situation resolved the way it did. Grateful that Susan got help, even if it came in the form of legal consequences. Grateful that the HOA reformed itself instead of digging in and defending the indefensible. And grateful that I lived in a place where people ultimately did the right thing. The snow falls every winter in Rochester, Minnesota. It piles up in driveways and yards and streets. It gets plowed and shoveled and pushed into mounds that sit until the spring thaw. It's a normal part of life in the northern Midwest, as unremarkable as rain in Seattle or heat in Phoenix. But for me, snow piles will always be a reminder of the time I stood up to an out-of-control HOA president and won. Of the time a police officer measured my snow pile and found it within code by 6 inches. Of the time my entire neighborhood came together to fix a broken system. It's a good reminder. And every time I pile snow in my driveway, I make sure it's exactly 3 feet 6 inches tall and exactly 6 feet 6 inches from the street, just because I can.